and I pray that this will still be used for your glory. In your son's name I pray, amen. Okay, well, we are finishing our study on the book of Samuel. It feels oddly appropriate given the time of year and the current situation. So, the last few chapters are generally designated as the epilogue. It's chapters 21 to 24, and we have essentially 5 different stories. We have the accusation by the Gibeonites, then we have David's song of thanksgiving, we have his final public address, then a list of his officers or champions, and finally his military census. And last few times we've met, we covered the accusation by the Gibeonites, and last time we did the song of thanksgiving leading up to Thanksgiving. And we're going to just wrap up with the last 3 stories. So it begins. Verse 1, these are the last words of David. Now, this is not the first time that we have seen a final address. Even in our little study of Samuel, we've already seen one. Prominent final public addresses includes Jacob's blessing in Genesis 49. We have Moses' final speech in Deuteronomy 31 to 33. There's Joshua's final speech in chapters 23 to 24. And of course, Samuel's speech in 1 Samuel 12, which we covered, feels like a long time ago. And tonight we're going to do, among other things, David's speech in 2 Samuel 23. And it's very similar to his final speech given to us in 1 Chronicles 28. So it begins, the declaration of David, son of Jesse, the declaration of the man raised on high. So the speech is in a poetic format. Last time we talked about poetry and David's song of thanksgiving. And of course, one of the staples of Old Testament Hebrew poetry is parallels. So we have the 2 lines, the declaration of David, son of Jesse, the logical, now we as people who've read the Bible and studied the Bible, we know who Jesse is, obviously. We've got the book of Ruth, and we're introduced to him in 1 Samuel. He's the descendant of Boaz, who is the descendant of Rahab from Joshua. Boaz marries Ruth, of course, and they have Obed. Obed is the father of Jesse, and so on. But in this context, who's Jesse? Jesse's really not all that important. He's from a fairly obscure family somewhere in Judah. And that's the point. David is the son of nobody. He is not the son of a prince. He's not the son of a king. He's not the son of some lord. He is the son of some sheep herder from Bethlehem. And it's paralleled with the declaration of the man raised on high. So, yes, David has been exalted, but in order to be exalted, you must first be humble. So David was someone of no standing who has been exalted to high standing, just as he was previously the son of Jesse, which meant nothing, but now he's obviously somebody very important. I have an audience member. We're not starting over. So the next line is, the one anointed by the God of Jacob, the favorite singer of Israel. So we've got these 2 little epithets of David. He's anointed. We know this, of course, from Samuel anointing him. And he's the favorite singer of Israel. Now, we know David as a songwriter, as a psalmist. The favorite singer, the best singer, preferred singer. We should already know that David is not the most humble person. So the favorite singer, the best singer in all of Israel. Okay. We also have the couplet, right, that he's the anointed of Jacob and the favorite singer of Israel. So Jacob and Israel being together. So we've got the 2 couplets. So then in verse 2, the Spirit of the Lord spoke through me. His word was on my tongue. Okay. He's being spoken through. And then verse 3, the God of Israel spoke, the rock of Israel said to me. So we've already seen this kind of language in his psalm of thanksgiving, referring to God as a rock. So God of Israel, rock of Israel, is fairly similar. And then it goes on, the one who rules the people with justice, who rules in the fear of God. So here we have these two different ideas. We have the idea of justice, and we've kind of talked about that fairly recently, the idea of establishing and maintaining the status quo. And in particular, we have this idea of the fear of God, which is of particular interest to me. In particular, we have the fear of God goes back to the expectation for the king. So going back to Deuteronomy 17, that one of the mandates for the king of Israel is to write out a copy of the law. Now, we don't know exactly what the law means. So does it mean the entire book of Deuteronomy? Does it mean the statutes? Does it mean specifically the instructions of the king? It's not clear. But the reason why he's supposed to do all this, first of all, to keep him humble, but also so that he can learn to fear the Lord. So this is one of the expectations. The king needs to learn how to fear the Lord. Now, what exactly does that mean? And what does all this entail? That's a whole other issue. But here, David at least is saying of himself to some extent that he is doing this, or he has done this. At least that's what he is saying about himself. It's particularly interesting that this expression, the fear of the Lord, the Yirat Yahweh, the earliest use we have of this is in the Davidic Psalms, this particular phrase. So it is of interest to David. He has a certain investment with this. So Psalm 19 and a few others. Here in 19, he goes, the instruction of the Lord is perfect, the testimony of the Lord is trustworthy, the precepts of the Lord are right, the command of the Lord is radiant, the fear of the Lord is pure, and the ordinances of the Lord are reliable. So all these expressions. Psalm 19 is a very interesting psalm in many ways. For one, it's the only time we have all this legal language, right? The instructions, the testimonies, the precepts, the commands, with the fear of the Lord. It's the only time that these words all appear together in the same context. But that's a whole other thing. So, verse 4 is like the morning light when the sun rises on a cloudless morning, the glisten of rain on sprouting grass. They're just all trickling in. So, this imagery, right, the morning light, the cloudless morning, and so on, is fairly standard and fairly positive. And then we get to the kind of the theological meat. Is it not true my house is with God? So here we have the word house, and that the house is with God. This has particularly significant meaning for David, and this goes back all the way to 2 Samuel 7. So this is in the immediate, we're in 2 Samuel 23. So in 2 Samuel 7, David has said that he wants to build God a house. And the prophet says to him, okay, it's fine, go ahead. And then God shows up to tell the prophet, no, I don't want you building a house. And this is kind of the beginning of the rebuke. So in verse 6, from the time I brought the Israelites out of Egypt until today, I have not lived in a house. So a house here referring just a permanent structure, right? He technically doesn't have any permanent residence, but he allowed himself to be moved through the desert in the tabernacle, this mobile tent, a mobile temple. Mobile meaning it's not permanent because he does not have a permanent residence. That seems important to Yahweh. Instead, I have been moving around with a tent as my dwelling. In all my journeys, and just as a aside, it's always been curious to me, and I'm sure there's some theology to it, although I haven't read any good treatment of it because it would require a firm knowledge of the Old Testament, and why would New Testament scholars read the Old Testament? But in the New Testament, we're referred to as temples, which are permanent dwellings. We're not referred to as tabernacles, which you would think there's a lot of theology in that because our bodies are temporary, right? We are mobile. This is not a permanent fixture, and yet we are still called temples. There might be something to that, but that's a whole other thing. So in verse 7, in all my journeys with all the Israelites, have I ever asked anyone among the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why haven't you built me a house of cedar? So David, is pretty much the first thing he did when he took up residence in Jerusalem was built himself a really nice house. And then after he had built himself a really nice house, because you got to take care of yourself first, right, obviously. Then afterwards, like, oh, I should do something for God. And God's like, who are you to do something for me? That's not how this works. I don't need anything from you. I don't ask anything from you. Also, the fact that he thought of himself first and then thought of God, I'm sure was also kind of infuriating. But then we're going to skip down to verse 11. This is where the really interesting part begins. So verse 11, the Lord declares to you, right? I'm telling you, not the other way around. The Lord himself will make a house for you. So you don't build me a house, I'm building you a house. Now, David already has a nice house, right? He already built himself. He took the time, right? Because the first thing he did was build himself a nice house. So he's set. But God's like, no. I build you a house. But obviously, he's not talking about a building like this, right? With stone and wood and fixtures and so on. I'm going to make you something permanent. I'm going to give you a permanent dwelling, a permanent fixture. And of course, we're going to get a clarification about what he means by house. And then we get into the whole, words can mean whatever you want. No, we're not doing that. So in verse 12, when your time comes and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up after you your descendant, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So here, what God obviously means is I'm going to give you a house, meaning I am going to give you a permanent lineage, a permanent family. We call it the house of David for a reason. And this is fairly accepted all throughout the ancient world. We have the word house referring to a family. So the house of so-and-so is the family of so-and-so. So God can use puns. God makes jokes, and yes, he can use puns. So he's like, you want to build me a house, that's not going to work. I'm going to make you a house, and by house he means a family. I'm going to give you a family. And then we get a further play on word, he will build a house for my name. Now, what does that mean exactly? Are we talking about the temple that Solomon builds or something else? And that's a whole nother issue. But here, because we're in chapter 23, verse 5, because is it not true that my house is with God? He's probably not referring to a physical building or a structure or anything like that. He's probably referring to his family, the family that God promised him all the way back in chapter 7. Now, we know that his family is a little dysfunctional and that they've been killing each other the last couple of chapters. But he's still speaking poetically and he's speaking very positively. And of course, we know that he has an established family and his family is going to endure, which is what he follows up with in the next line. For he has established an everlasting covenant with me. It's not entirely true. He made a covenant with his descendant, and which is retroactively applied to him and moves forward. But the covenant is attached to his family, to the Davidic line. So his family is going to endure forever. Ordered and secure in every detail, will he not bring about my whole salvation and my every desire? That's a really odd thing for him to end on. Not only was God going to bring him salvation, but he's also going to fulfill his every desire. Now, we've seen that God has pretty much given David everything he could ever want. Every little thing that pops into his head, everything that's in his heart, some good and some bad, right? Even after he takes the Bathsheba, after he sleeps with Bathsheba, God says, if you just ask for stuff, I'd give it to you. Right? Whatever you want, what have I withheld from you? And you go and take someone else's wife. That's kind of part of the indictment. So I don't know if this is entirely positive, what he means here, or negative. It's not clear. But he goes on, verse 6. But all the wicked are like thorns raked aside. They can never be picked up by hand. The man who touches them must be armed with iron and the shaft of a spear. They will be completely burned up on the spot. So David is going to be preserved. He's going to endure. His family is going to endure because they have the covenant. And everyone else, all the enemies, all the evil people, they're going to be burned up and destroyed. That's fairly basic Old Testament theology. I mean, going back to Psalm 1. So that's it. That's David's final address. It's short, it's sweet. And then we move on to his mighty men and the officers, the soldiers under David. So in verse 8, I know it's just a kind of a radical shift, but this is what's next. These are the names of David's warriors. So we're going to go through the list of his officers, his commanders and captains, and it's about as exciting as it sounds. But it's still rather curious what it says and what it doesn't say. So it begins. and I'm going to completely butcher these names because I don't care and I'm tired. Josheb Bashebeth, the Tahkemonite, was chief of the officers. He wielded his spear against 800 men that he killed at one time. Okay, so we're first introduced to Josheb. So he is listed as the chief officer. I'm going to call him the colonel, and there's a reason for that. Next, we have Eleazar, son of Dodo. It's a great name. Son of an Ahahite, was among the 3 warriors with David when they defied the Philistines. The men of Israel retreated in the place they had gathered for battle, but Eleazar stood his ground and attacked the Philistines until his hand was tired and stuck to his sword. The Lord brought about a great victory that day. Then the troops came back to him, but only to plunder the dead. That's very impressive. After him was Shammah, son of Agi, the Hararite. The Philistines had assembled in formation where there was a field full of lentils. The troops fled from the Philistines, but Shammah took his shield in the middle of the field, defended it, and struck down the Philistines. So the Lord brought about a great victory. So we have Josheb, who's the chief of all the officers, and then we have these 2 high officers that serve under him in some capacity. And they seem to be designated. They're below Josheb, but they're above all the others. So then in verse 13, 3 of the 30, we're going to come back to the 30, leading warriors went down at harvest time and came to David at the cave of Adullam. So this was a while ago, right, when he was still on the run. While a company of Philistines was camping in the valley of Rephaim. At that time, David was in the stronghold, and a Philistine garrison was at Bethlehem. David was extremely thirsty and said, "If only someone would bring me water to drink from the well at the city gate of Bethlehem." So 3 of the warriors broke through the Philistine camp and drew water from the well at the gate of Bethlehem. Now, we've already been introduced to 3, right? We've already met Huey, Dewey, and Louie. There's nothing specifically to indicate that these are the 3 that they're talking about, because we just know that it's 3. 3 of the captains. So it's not clear exactly who the 3 are. We don't get a clear identification. We just know that it's 3 captains. But most scholars accept that it's probably not these 3. We're getting a whole other story. So verse 16. So 3 of the warriors broke through the Philistine camp and drew water from the gate of Bethlehem. They brought it back to David, but he refused to drink it. Instead, he poured it out to the Lord. David said, "Lord, I would never do such a thing. Is this not the blood of men who risked their lives?" So we refused to drink it. Such were the exploits of the 3 warriors. So this is a sweet story. It's in any other place in the book of Samuel, it probably would be remembered very fondly. It's just kind of awkward here just to hear about these 3 warriors and what they did in service to David, that they were willing to go to such lengths, their devotion to him, and what, also David taking this water and then pouring it out of the ground is, I think, supposed to be a genuine act of offering, right? I was actually messaging a friend of mine this evening, and he was asking me, this poor guy, he is trying to read through the Old Testament. He's getting bogged down in Exodus. And he's reading through all the sacrifices in Exodus. And out of the blue, he asked me, he goes, I'm reading through the blood. And I'm like, I'm sorry for you. And he said, what I didn't realize is all the restrictions you have to do with fat. And he's like, why on earth can you not eat or do anything with the fat? And why is the fat listed with the blood? And I said that my understanding is that they have the blood and the fat together because blood is sacred, and you clearly can't drink the blood. You have to pour it out because the blood is sacred. The blood is where the life is. And the fat, however, because you have multiple verses in Leviticus and elsewhere, where it describes the fat as being particularly pleasing. The fat is the best part. And because it's the best, it's entirely reserved for Yahweh. Even the priests are restricted to how much they can have and what they can do with it. So it has to be burned up for the Lord. So the best part of the animal, the best part of the offering, has to go to the Lord. There are no exceptions. So here you have this water that's being offered to David. And David, in a moment, I assume, of genuine piety, realizes how precious this is, and the only thing he can think to do with it is to pour it on the ground for Yahweh. So it's a libation, right? You're pouring it out as an offering to God. It's a fairly universal symbol. Plenty of cultures do that kind of thing, and so David is doing this. It's not that he's just wasting the water, he's pouring it out for the Lord. Verse 18, Abishai, Joab's brother and son of Zeruiah, was leader of the three, presumably the three that went and got the water, whoever they are. He raised his spear against 300 men and killed them, gaining a reputation among the three. Was he not more honored than the three? He became their commander, even though he did not become one of the three. Okay, so there's a method to my madness. So Abishai is special forces. So he's got 3 commanders under him that are all highly skilled, highly trained, that do the work that nobody else wants to do or no one else can do. And he is their leader. So he is highly skilled, highly technical, very surgical. He does the really dirty stuff, the really difficult stuff. And we should know Abishai because we've seen him pop up in a number of places, and he tends to be, again, where the really dirty fighting is. And he has, again, these 3 commanders who fight under him, and they're all just the best of the best. Then verse 20, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was the son of a brave man from Kabzeel, a man of many exploits. Benaiah killed 2 sons of Ariel of Moab, and he went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. So that's always a test of bravery, right? Samson ripped a lion apart with his bare hands. He also killed an Egyptian, a huge man. I don't know why we need to know how big he is, but he was a huge man. Even though the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, Benaiah went down to him with a club, snatched the spear out of the Egyptian's hand, and then killed him with his own spear. That's how great he was. These were the exploits of Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, who had a reputation among the 3 warriors. He was the most honored of the 30, but he did not become one of the 3. David put him in charge of his own bodyguard. So, Benaiah is captain of David's bodyguard, which is a very prestigious position, right? You usually want someone of very capable, very powerful, very trusted, right? Because he's the one who is personally in charge of the king's security. You usually don't give that job to someone who's either not capable or not trustworthy. So this is a highly, highly respected position. Probably just as respected, just as favored as any of the other top positions. So, what? No, he did. Yeah. I don't know how much you follow the news. Yes, he is, yeah. Anyway. Then we have the 30. And because my OCD is going to kick in, it's not 30, it's 32. I guess it's just a rounding error, but they're called the 30 because that sounds better than the 32, I guess. I don't know why. This reminds me of, I had to do a paper on the Enuma Elish, which is the creation epic in Akkadian. And at the end, the very last part is about the exaltation of Marduk and why Marduk is the greatest god of all time. And so while all the other gods are honoring Marduk, they bestow upon him 50 names. The issue is, when you read the names, there's not 50 names. It's 51 names. Why? Why would you do this to me? Why would you call it the 50 names of Marduk when there's not 50 names? And I don't know. I don't know if it's a rounding error. I don't know if they just didn't know how to count properly. I don't know. It's incredibly frustrating. But here we have the 30 captains, but there's not 30, there's 32. And we have confirmation at the end because it's going to say these are all 37. Well, we just had 5, and now we're going to have 30. 30 and 5 don't make 37. Anyway, so we have all the officers. We've got the chief officer, we have his 2 subordinates, we have Abishai, who's the captain of the special forces, and then we have the bodyguard, and then we have the 30 captains below. So we get the 32 people. Joab's brother Asahel, Elhanan, son of Dodo of Bethlehem, Shammah the Herodite, Alika the Herodite, Helez the Paltite, Ira, son of Ikesh the Tekoite, Abiezer the Anathothite, Mabunai the Hushathite, Zalman the Ahahite, Maharai the Netophathite, Heleb, son of Bana the Netophathite, Ittai, son of Ribai from Gibeah of the Benjaminites, Benaiah the Pirathonite, Hiddai from the wadis of Gaash, Abi Alban the Arbathite, Asmaveth the Barhumite, Eliaba the Shaalbanite, the sons of Jeshin. This is where we get the other two, because we get 30 names within the two sons of Jeshin who aren't named for some reason. I don't know why their names are missing, but that's where the two are missing. Jonathan, son of Shammah the Herahite, Ahiam, son of Sherar the Hararite, Eliphelet, son of Ahasbai, son of Ma'akathite, Eliam, son of Ahithophel the Gilonite, Hezro the Carmelite, Paarai the Arbite, Igal, son of Nathan from Zobah, Bani the Gadite, Zelek the Ammonite, Naharai the Beerothite, the armor-bearer for Joab, son of Zeruiah, Ira the Ithrite, Gareb the Ithrite, and Uriah the Hittite. There were 37 in all. So we get the final total. All right, so we just went through all of these. Something doesn't quite add up. I know it's not that there's 30 names and not 32. Someone's missing. Now, we have gone through 1st and 2nd Samuel. I've taken you through both books. There's a name that should be in this list, a name that we should know very well, be pretty intimate with. Well, what? No. We're missing somebody. We're missing the guy who's over the entire show, the guy who has been by David's side pretty much since before the beginning, who is the head of the entire military forces, the one who's over everything. I'm going to call him the field marshal, the one who the men are more loyal to this man than they are to David. Of course, I'm talking about Joab, and I weren't consistent with my grasp, but yeah. Why isn't Joab mentioned? That's really strange. It's particularly strange because Abishai is mentioned, his brother. It even mentions Abishai, the brother of Joab, as if we forget who Abishai is. I mean, he's been in quite a few stories. We're even mentioned the one guy, I forget his name off the top of my head, but it says so-and-so, the armor bearer of Joab. So the assistant to Joab is mentioned in the 30 captains, but Joab is not mentioned. Probably the most important man in David's military. Now, some commentaries who want to take this all more positively than I'm going to will say, well, I mean, Joab is so important that he's kind of just over the military, sort of, I guess you could say, like the Secretary of Defense. Like, he's not really in the military, he's just kind of over it, so he wouldn't be listed with the rank in service. I don't think that's it. I think his name's been taken from the list. I think that after all the horrible things he's done, he murdered, right, David's cousin to get his position back. He's been flaunting his authority. He's basically turned the army. That hasn't really turned it on against David, but David, through his mishandling of the army is kind of flocked under Joab, and now the army's more loyal to Joab. He's borderline treasonous at this point. It's very strange, but I think it's intentional that his name is not listed. Oh yeah, he's still alive. Oh yeah, he's still alive. The other really interesting thing, because we get an important confirmation in this list, the very last name, Uriah the Hittite, who he is dead, but he still gets listed. He's still in the, I guess, because we all know that military records are never cleaned up. It's like once you're enlisted, you're enlisted for life, and even after, right? It's like the voter rolls. They're always there. Once you're in, you're in. Uriah was one of the captains. He was one of the officers. That's probably why he was allowed to live in Jerusalem, because since Jerusalem is the capital, that's pretty prime real estate, and usually only people of high importance or close to the king would be allowed to live near the king. So Uriah is not just some random soldier in the army. He's not some guy that David doesn't know. This is one of his officers. This is someone that he would have trusted, someone that he probably had as a friend, or at least, he knew well enough. It's not like Uriah is just some complete stranger. No, he's one of the 37 ranking officers in his army. I think it's completely acceptable to assume David knew him pretty well, and he had him murdered. You would think that. You would think that he knew the family. When we find out, like you said, that she was related to his advisor. So this is just kind of lets us know a little more about Uriah, just out of the blue, because oh yeah, we forgot about Uriah. Nope, here he pops up again. So why do we get this list? And we'll see it laid out in just a second, but we'll come back to why the list is here, because I'll show you a visual, and that'll help kind of solidify it. But we now get the final story in 2 Samuel. I'm going to call it the final straw, which I think is a very appropriate thing to call 2 Samuel 24. Verse 1. The Lord's anger burned against Israel again, and he stirred up David against them to say, "Go count the people of Israel and Judah." So, we have stories like in the Exodus, where Moses will ask Yahweh, "Yahweh, how do you know what's going to happen?" And God says, "I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart." So here we have the Lord stirring up David. And I'm going to get yelled at for this, but we have the same story in 1 Chronicles 21, where it's clarified that it was Satan who went to David. Now, the way to reconcile these is that Satan could have been sent by God, which is what happens with Job, right? Satan goes to God, and God points out Job to him, and then Satan goes to torment Job. So we could have a similar situation here, but either way, it seems like God has allowed for this to take place. So David is being stirred up to do something rather naughty. Now, I think that there is a loose chiastic structure to the epilogue. We begin with the accusation of the Gibeonites, then we have David's song of thanksgiving, we have his final speech, we have the champions, and then we have the military census. The reason why the first and the last are significant is because we basically have a story about this lingering sin, supposedly, that Saul did, and the ramifications of that sin even after his death, right? The sins that he did as king have haunted Israel. And now we are going to be faced with one of David's sins as king and how it's going to haunt Israel. But to go back to the story of the champions, that would mean the story of the list of David's officers is parallel to the Song of Thanksgiving. So in his Song of Thanksgiving, he is giving thanks to Yahweh for all the things Yahweh has done for him. Here, we're getting a list of all the people that have basically served David and who have aided him and helped him become king and maintain his authority. So we have two stories of thanks, right? He's thanking God for all the things that God has done, but now he's acknowledging and thanking the men who have served under him and helped him maintain his rule. So I think that the two do parallel and go together to some extent. And then in the middle, we have his final address where he's kind of praising himself because he has to pat himself on the back. So, I mean, he's David. He can't help himself. We get throughout 2 Samuel, mainly 2 Samuel, we get 4 sins. These are the 4 sins. And really, these are the only 4 that we have really zeroed in on throughout the story of David as king. 2 he does in his capacity as king, and 2 he does that are personal, that he does, again, on an intimate level, that he takes part in as a man, right, as an individual, not necessarily as king. This is an important distinction because in Chronicles is not very kind to David. It does not pull its punches, except it focuses on the royal sins, right? What his failure as king, and tends to gloss over, if not ignore, his private sins. Because it's not interested in what he does as a man, it's concerned with what he does as king. So his private sins, his personal sins, are his affair with Bathsheba, and of course, his orchestration of Uriah's murder. Now, these are both bad enough because both of them are capital offenses under Deuteronomy. Sleeping with a married woman is punishable by death. There is no exception. There is no way around that. There's no sacrifice. We're like, there's no sacrifice I can give. You're right. It's death. There is no way out of this. And murder is also an absolute capital offense. There's no way around murder. But we have the two royal sins. We have his public sins, the ones that he does as king. The first one is he brings the ark into Jerusalem, which is one of his major failures. We know this because the guy dies, right? The guy that's driving the cart. And when he gets mad, he's mad at Yahweh. Why did you allow this to happen? And the priests have to come and tell him, well, you weren't moving it properly. You didn't ask God whether or not he wanted it moved. You didn't do anything you're supposed to. And so Chronicles gives us a lot more context for that and also why it was wrong for David to move the ark. Now we get the second major failure that David did as king. And I think it's probably also fitting that the sin of the ark happens fairly early in his reign. He's taken Jerusalem, he builds his house, and then he wants to bring in the ark. So it's pretty early on. This is before his affair with Bathsheba. The military census seems to be towards the end of his reign, and most commentaries seem to accept that. So the ark is early on, and then the census is towards the end. Now, we get to why. Why is the military census such a major sin? And to be honest, it's never really laid out in Scripture. Samuel doesn't really tell us why it was wrong. Deuteronomy doesn't give us anything specific, and Chronicles is kind of vague, other than the fact that it's just wrong and God was really angry that it happened. I think the obvious answer is kind of keyed in by what Samuel tells us and also from Deuteronomy. So in 1 Samuel 10:25, we have Samuel proclaim to the people the rights of kingship. He wrote them on a scroll, which he placed in the presence of the Lord. Then Samuel sent all the people away, each to his home. So the people have come to Samuel and they want a king. And Samuel says, fine. God tells him to go and find a king. He goes and finds Saul. And he's instructed to give the rights of kingship and to teach Saul how to be king. And this is probably referring to the law of the king as outlined in Deuteronomy 17. So, in Deuteronomy 17, we have, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, take possession of it, live in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations around me. You are to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. Appoint a king from your brothers you are not to set a foreigner over you, or one who is not of your people. So then we have the three stipulations. He must not acquire horses for himself or send the people back to Egypt to acquire many horses, for the Lord has told you, you are never to go back that way again. So, no horses. He must not acquire many wives for himself so that his heart won't go astray. No wives. Must not acquire very large amounts of silver and gold for himself. So, no horses, no women, and no gold. The point of the stipulations, and this seems to be fairly accepted, the reason why you acquire horses is for the army, for the military. Horses are animals for war. They are not agricultural animals. They're not bovine. They're not cows. They're not oxen. They're not beasts of burden like donkeys or mules or anything like that. Horses are almost exclusively bred for war. They're not even like long-distance traveling animals like camels, right? So they are prized possessions and are usually reserved for military. The only reason why a king would stock up on horses is because he's building up an army. The wives probably is referring to foreign wives. The main reason why you would marry a foreign princess is to make a treaty with the foreign princess. And you're not allowed to make treaties. This is outlined elsewhere in Deuteronomy, also in Joshua. You're not allowed to make treaties with other nations. So the assumption here is don't marry foreign women. It says don't multiply wives is mainly applying to foreign women, and the reason why you do that is to make a treaty. Can't do any of that. And then finally, material wealth. You can't build up a treasury. You can't overtax the citizens. In fact, there's not a whole lot of stipulations about what the tax would even look like, which of course we know that the king takes over the tithe, which is a whole other issue. So, no army, no treaties, no material wealth. And of course, Solomon egregiously breaks all three of them. But we're not at Solomon yet. We're at David. And David, we also know, breaks all of them. He marries a bunch of women, which he shouldn't do. He stockpiles gold, although not to the extent that Solomon will. And we know he has a fairly large army, but we're going to find out just how large the army is. And that seems to be the issue here. This could very well be a sort of Samson-esque situation where Samson was supposed to be a Nazirite, and of course, as a Nazirite, he's not supposed to drink any alcohol, he's not supposed to touch dead bodies, and he's not supposed to cut his hair. Well, we know he's drinking alcohol because he's partying with the Philistines. We know he's touching dead bodies because he was touching the lion and getting honey out of the lion and then feeding it to his parents, which is really gross. The only restriction he never broke was cutting his hair. And then when he finally broke that, that's when he lost his strength, because he had violated every part of the Nazirite vow. It seems like with David, we know he's marrying women, and women he shouldn't be marrying. We know he's stockpiling gold. But I assume that the point here is he hasn't really taken pride in his army yet, even though we know he has a very impressive army. So this is the final straw. He's going to break the final restriction that God placed on the position of the king. So Joab. Remember Joab? The guy that was conveniently left out of the list of officers, the one who is over the army. So David has said he wants to take a census. And Joab, who is one of my favorite characters in the Bible, I've said this multiple times, because he is perhaps the most morally gray person. He is the most utilitarian person of all. He is not just cartoonishly evil villain, which we have some of those in the Bible, and he is certainly not righteous. He has no moral compass. He just does whatever needs to be done, and he does generally what David tells him to do. He is a fascinating character. Joab replies to the king, "May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times more than they are, while my lord the king looks on. But why does my lord the king want to do this?" Even Joab, who's pretty much game for anything, who pretty much does whatever David tells him to, who he will climb a water shaft if David tells him to. He will jump through fire if David tells him to. He will murder anybody and everybody, even without David telling him to. He will do whatever needs to be done. And all of a sudden, Joab's a little nervous. Joab's not sure this is what they need to be doing. This is just what's incredible about this story. When Joab is the voice of reason, you know you've done something really wrong. And Joab is telling David, I don't think you should do this. Verse 4, yet the king's order prevailed over Joab. Just incredible. And the commanders of the army, so it's not just Joab. Some of those other commanders, right, the ones that we were just introduced to in the list of officers, some of them also went to David and said, I'm not sure we should be doing this. And David's like, I don't care, I want this census. Okay. So Joab and the commanders of the army left the king's presence to register the troops of Israel. Oh, boy. So, the yellow is Jerusalem, presumably where they start, because that's where David is, that's where the capital is. They crossed the Jordan. The Jordan is the river that flows north-south, kind of cuts through Israel, and camped in Aroer, south of the town in the middle of the valley. So Aroer is the red. You can see the little arrow there. See, isn't that nice and pretty? So they cross over the Jordan, probably right north of the Dead Sea. They go into the Reuben territory, and so they're just above Moab. This is kind of the southeastern border of Israel. And then proceed toward Gad and Jezer. So Gad is the territory north of Reuben, and Jezer is kind of a city right in the middle. So they're making their way up the eastern border of Israel. They went to Gilead and to the land of the Hittites. Now, the land of the Hittites should be up in Turkey, but for some reason, we're not told. They didn't go all the way to Turkey. That's ridiculous. There's probably a community of Hittites. Possibly that's where Uriah is from. Some Hittites who have maybe they were driven away from their home or whatever, and they've started up a little community, a little village of ethnic, Hittites that have perhaps converted to Judaism or whatever, and so now they've got a little territory up there near Gilead. So that's, again, this might be where Uriah is from. All right. So they went up, and Gilead is that blue territory north of Reuben, north of Gad. And continued on to Dan-Jan. So I don't think we know where John is, but Dan is the orange territory. That's the northernmost tribe. But they go past Dan all the way to Sidon. I don't know why any Jews or Israelites are living in Sidon, but apparently they're living in Sidon. So they made their way all the way up to the very tip-top northern edge of our map. So they have made their way, they've gone up the eastern side of the Jordan all the way, and presumably they've taken tally and note of all the fighting-aged men as they go. They went to the fortress of Tyre. So Tyre, right, as in the city that Ezekiel judges later on. And Tyre is the main coastal city to the south of Sidon. That's the purple. They went to the fortress of Tyre and all the cities of the Hivites and Canaanites. I have no idea how many there are. I didn't mark them all. I didn't try. Afterward, they went to the Negev of Judah at Beersheba. So the Negev is the desert that kind of borders the southern tip of Judah. And you got a few villages down there. Generally, what's accepted to be the southernmost Israelite village is Beersheba, which is the blue all the way down. So I think I did a decent enough job. So you can kind of see how they went around and they conducted their census. When they had gone through the whole land, they returned to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. It took them almost 10 months to do this census. And Israel is not the largest of territories, right? I mean, it's rather small. Joab gave the king the total of the registration of the troops. There were 800,000 fighting men from Israel and 500,000 men from Judah. That's astonishing. Judah is just one tribe. Fair enough, Judah is the largest tribe and the most populated, but still, that's almost half the army is coming from Judah. Now, Chronicles gives us an interesting little tidbit because Joab fudged the numbers. Because Joab didn't want to tell David the actual total. See, this is why you got to read the whole Bible. You can't just read Samuel, you can't read Chronicles, you have to read the whole thing. So Chronicles tells us that in all there were 1,100,000 swordsmen, and in Judah itself 470,000. So I guess Chronicles or Samuel is just rounding. I don't know. But he did not include Levi and Benjamin in the count because the king's command was detestable to him. Now, I don't know why he would count Levi anyway, because they're priests. I'm not sure why they'd be fighting or why they would contribute to the military. I would assume that as Levites, they're exempt because they have other duties, other responsibilities. Benjamin is interesting, that Benjamin's not included. That would be the previously royal tribe. Also, we know Benjamin's kind of cursed because of the shenanigans that happened at the end of Judges. But it is curious that Joab doesn't bother or doesn't want to tell David how many are in Benjamin. It might not be very many. It's not clear, but it is interesting. So in verse 10, David's conscience troubled him after he had taken a census of the troops. Little late, he said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I've done. No kidding. Now, Lord, because I've been very foolish, please take away your servant's guilt. Oh, boy. So he knows that he goofed. He did something he wasn't supposed to do, which Joab and others had already told him he shouldn't do. And now he's saying, please take away the guilt. Now, guilt is important. It's an important word. He's basically saying, don't punish me for what I've done. That's usually not how this works. When you've done something wrong, you need to be punished. That's just how it works. That's what happens in a righteous situation, a just situation. You've done the crime, you need to do the time. So God's not going to take this well. So verse 11, when David got up in the morning, a revelation from the Lord had come to the prophet Gad. What happened to Gad? The last time we saw him, as far as I know, he was in Moab, wandering around. So just to remind you, when David was running from Saul, because I know you all remember this, but this is like one of my favorite stories about David. He's on the run from Saul, and he takes his family, and he defects to Moab. He goes to the king and basically says, I'm prepared to, as long as you grant me amnesty and take care of my family, I'm willing to serve in your army. And so he's basically defecting. So Gad shows up kind of just out of nowhere, just poofs, and starts kind of beating David over the head with a stick and says, what are you doing? You can't defect and join an enemy army. You can't go and serve a foreign king. You've already been anointed the next king of Israel. You got to go back. And this is kind of the great moment of awakening for David when he realizes that he has to go back and just trust Yahweh. And then we get into the more positive moment in David's life when he's actually on the run and he's trusting God and so on. So this is kind of where it starts. And Gad was the one who literally knocked the sense into him, kind of like Rafiki does to Simba in The Lion King. That's what this is from. So Gad is the one who shows up. I like Gad. He's one of my favorite prophets. We don't see enough of him. He's not the idiot Nathan who tells David it's okay to build the temple, and then God has to chastise Nathan and be like, what are you doing? So I don't know why Gad wasn't the one David went to in the first place for that. But anyway, Gad has shown up again. So Gad, David's seer, he shows up and says, go and say to David, this is what the Lord says. I am offering you 3 choices. Choose one of them and I will do it to you. That's usually not a good sign, right? So Gad went to David, told him the choices, and asked him, do you want 3 years of famine to come to your land, to flee from the foes 3 months while they pursue you, or to have a plague in your land for 3 days? Now think it over and decide one answer I should take back to the one who sent me. So David has committed a public sin. He has sinned as king by taking the census. And he's given 3 choices. There can be a famine, because since he's taken the census, he knows how many men he has, he knows what he can do with it. God's going to diminish the number. He's going to screw up the census. So he'll send a famine, which will lower the number quite a bit. He can have an enemy army come in and drive David away, which seems a little more focused on David, but presumably this will be just a massive war that will engulf the nation. Or he can send a plague that will just ravage through the land for 3 days. So we have famine, war, and pestilence, which, yes, those are 3 of the 4 calamities that we see pop up over and over again. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Revelation. The only one we're missing are the wild animals. So he's not going to send wild animals on David. This does, to me, kind of mirror what Solomon is going to get later, because here we have David giving us 3 open-ended choices, right? Do you want the sword? Do you want famine? Do you want pestilence? I'm watching the time. But with Solomon, right, Solomon's given the positive. He's like, Solomon, would you like more life? Would you like gold? Or would you like to be victorious as king? And Solomon, he gives the right answer. He goes, you pick for me. Because Solomon was wise, and Solomon knew you don't choose. When God gives you a choice, you don't choose. Except if you're Ahab, in which case that was not a good idea. So, verse 14, David answered Gad, I have great anxiety. I bet you do. Please let us fall into the Lord's hand because his mercies are great. That's the right answer. Aren't you proud of David? He has had a moment, a genuine moment. He knows what to say. He knows, okay, I've screwed up. You've given me choices. I'm going to let you choose. David, he has a moment of genuine, no, he doesn't. Of course he doesn't. Don't let me fall into the human hands. So do what you need to do, but don't let it affect me. That's not the right answer. In fact, the right answer would have been, I'm assuming, don't punish the kingdom for my sin. Affect me. Take it out on me. Do what you need to do, but just spare me. Which is pretty much what he said over the Bathsheba incident. Like, take the guilt from me and don't kill me, even though I'm the one that had the affair. I'm the one that murdered Uriah. Just do what you need to do. Just spare my life. Too many. So we can see here at the end of David's life, he hasn't learned much. This is basically his same reaction that he had over the Bathsheba incident. Do what you need to do, but don't take it out on me. Even though, again, he's the one who has royally screwed up. And yes, there was some pun in that. So, as just a reminder, because this is not the first time, because I've already been asked, how many times has he done this? He's done this quite often. So back in chapter 15, Zadok was there, and all the Levites with him were carrying the Ark of the Covenant of God. They set the Ark of God down, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until the people had finished marching past. Then the king instructed Zadok, return the Ark of God to the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and allow me to see both it and its dwelling place. However, if he should say, I do not delight in you, then here I am. He can do with me whatever pleases him. So this is when David has been run out of Jerusalem by Absalom. And people are like, what are you going to do? And he goes, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to send the ark back, I'm going to send the priests back, and I'm just going to trust God that the right thing will happen. And this seems like the right thing to say, as though David knows what he should do, and he's going to trust God and just accept that the right thing. David is going full Calvinist here. It's all part of God's plan. It's all part of God's will. He reminds me of some of my, I loosely call them friends, but when I was in singles, and there was one friend in particular who he would just burn through girlfriends. And it wasn't necessarily particularly nefarious. It was just he just went through girlfriends. And every time it was just the same thing. The girl would dump him or whatever, and then he'd be like, I was crazy. I shouldn't have been with her, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to trust God. I'm going to trust God, and he'll bring the right person into my life, and I'm just going to trust him, blah, blah, blah. And of course, the next girl he sees is the one that God brought into his life, right? So he seems to say the right thing. He seems to say, I'm going to trust God. And then the very next verse, the king also said to Zadok, because he can't shut up. He can't just say, I'm going to trust God and leave it at that. No, he can't do that, because this is David. Look, return to the city in peace, and your two sons with you, your son Ahimaaz and Abiathar's son Jonathan. Remember, I'll wait at the fords of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. So Zadok and Abiathar returned the ark to Jerusalem and stayed there. So, as I said when we covered chapter 15, there's the old saying, lock your car, or trust God, but lock up your car, right? So he's going to trust God, but it doesn't hurt to stack the deck, right? It doesn't hurt to put your finger on the scale to make sure that things aren't going to play out the way you don't want them to. So we're back in 24, verse 15. So the Lord sent a plague on Israel from that morning until the appointed time. And from Dan to Beersheba, 70,000 men died. Then the angel extended his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it. But the Lord relented concerning the destruction and said to the angel who was destroying the people, enough, withdraw your hand now. The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So the plague stops. Now we're going to get explanation about why it stopped. So verse 17. When David saw the angel striking the people, he said to the Lord, look, I am the one who has sinned. I am the one who has done wrong. But these sheep, what have they done? It's just always funny when people call their people, when they call their, the people they're watching over sheep. Please let your hand be against me and my father's family. This somewhat seems genuine, but this is what he should have said from the beginning. This is what he should have done. He shouldn't have waited until after the plague had started, right? After the bodies are piling up. He should have done it at the beginning. But I guess better late than never. So verse 18. Gad came to David that day and said to him, go up and set up an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David went up in obedience to Gad's command, just as the Lord had commanded him. Araunah, I can't know how to say that, looked down and saw the king and his servants coming toward him. So he went out and bowed to the king with his face to the ground. Araunah said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" David replied, "To buy the threshing floor from you in order to build an altar to the Lord, so the plague on the people may be halted." So 22, Araunah said to David, "My lord the king may take whatever he wants and offer it. Here are the oxen for a burnt offering and the threshing sledges and ox yokes for the wood. My king Araunah gives everything here to the king." Then he said to the king, "May the Lord your God accept you." So here's David, right? He's going to the threshing floor to make an offering, and if he makes the offering, then God will lift the plague or whatever. And the guy's like, "You're the king. You take whatever you need," right? Verse 24, the king answered Araunah, "No, I insist on buying it from you for a price, for I will not offer the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." Now, this is the right thing to say. You can't offer something that didn't cost you anything. That's why it's called a sacrifice, right? So David knows that he can't just take the threshing floor, and he can't just build an altar on someone else's property, and he can't offer up someone else's property. He has to pay for it. And in verse 25, David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 20 ounces of silver. He bought an altar to the Lord there and offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered prayer on behalf of the land, and the plague of Israel ended. Now, we do get additional information that clarifies what all happened from, of course, Chronicles. So in Chronicles 21, so David gave Ornan 15 pounds of gold for the plot. He built an altar to the Lord there and offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. He called on the Lord, and he answered him with fire from heaven on the altar of burnt offering. So we seem to get a clarification that David is not just buying this little spot, the threshing floor. He's buying the entire area, which is why it's cost so much. And this is important, right? So we're getting the backstory to something else. So in verse 28, at that time, David offered sacrifices there when he saw that the Lord answered him at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. The tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses made in the desert, and the altar of burnt offering were at the high place in Gibeon. But David could not go before it to inquire of God because he was terrified of the sword of the Lord's angel. Then David said, "This is the house of the Lord God, and this is the altar of burnt offering for Israel." So it's funny that David, he knows better than to go to the actual tabernacle because he knows God's angry with him, and he doesn't want to add insult to injury. He knows he's not in a righteous enough place or a purified state to go and directly inquire from the Lord because obviously God's mad at him. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a plague raging through Israel. So he's not completely incompetent, right? He has some understanding of what's going on. This, of course, is the peak, according to Jewish tradition, of Mount Moriah. This is all the way back in Genesis 22. "Take your son," he said, "your only son, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." And you can say, well, how do you know it's that one? Because Chronicles confirms this for us. So in 2 Chronicles 3, Solomon began to build the Lord's temple in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. At the site David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So it was because of David's mistake that he ended up buying the land and then using it or dedicating it for what will become the future temple. But that's it for 2 Samuel. I hope. They would have had to acquire it later, but he was able to buy it and dedicate it for that purpose. Oh yeah, God would not have been happy. God would not have been happy.
David was a mess. Oh my goodness. All right, next Sunday night, James is planning on teaching from Luke chapter 2, the nativity story. So give us a lot of information in background. It'll be interesting. So let's pray. Randall, would you close us out?